you when they say things like, "Oh, this guy could never fail anyone."
Oh,
If,
oh yeah.
You mean you do fail people?
uh, yes, I encourage people to leave the program. It's often better for them.
I see. I don't fail anybody.
All right, we are now recording.
This will be an excellent stream.
And let's see, Amy, I think you are running this last session.
Yes, I am. Let me just, I'm going to run this. Yeah. Competing dynamic walking. Yeah,
And then Jonah, are you able to share your screen?
Yep, let me do that now.
All right, take it
Can
away,
you
Amy.
all see that?
Okay. So hello everyone, welcome back to session 4. Going to be the best session. I'm Amy Wolf from Queen's University, and our next talk is by Jonah Sickman from Oregon State University on Cassie. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. This work looks at the application of a recurrent neural network architecture to the bipedal robot produced by Agility Robotics called Cassie. It will also cover some of the cool insights that we can glean by inspecting the memory of an RNN. To give you some context, our lab's work focuses on creating robust, agile bipedal locomotion on hardware robots, specifically for Cassie. We found that heuristic-based controllers or handmade controllers that were very successful for robots like Atreus tend to be brittle or limited in application when applied to a more complex robot like Cassie. Recently, we have focused on exploring reinforcement learning as a tool for generating robust learned controllers. Our previous work in applying DeepRL to legged locomotion thus far has used simple feed-forward neural networks with a great deal of success. The video playing right now is of one such feed-forward neural network. This controller was a significant contribution, but tended to be somewhat unstable when stepping in place or walking at low speeds or on inclines. We've iterated upon this result and been able to fix some of these deficiencies by using a different type of neural network called a recurrent neural network, which we will showcase in this presentation. Traditional neural networks approximate functions which are one-to-one. Given some input, they produce an output that is a nonlinear function of only that input. RNNs, on the other hand, produce output that is a function of their input and their previous output. In other words, their output is dependent on the current input and also through this recursive process of each output depending on its previous output, all previous outputs. Another way of seeing this is that RNNs have an internal state which they read from and write to every time they're evaluated, sort of like a computer. Intuitively then, we should expect memory to help with Cassie. If a human walks with a 5-pound ankle weight on one leg, they don't forget how to compensate for that discrepancy 30 times a second. They remember how to adapt their gait to compensate for the disturbance. Similarly, if we are using a neural network to control a robot, we want it to be able to account for disturbances to its gait. RNNs and their ability to learn to remember information could be beneficial to learning walking controllers. Feed-forward networks, on the other hand, might be unable to make use of important information which was observed several seconds in the past or over multiple time steps because there is no loopback or memory mechanism. There are also some theoretical benefits.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Sure.
Is your input sensors or is your input a full state estimated state?
That's actually the next slide or the one after. We'll get there in just a second. There are also some theoretical benefits to using RNNs. So feed-forward networks are limited because they are universal function approximators. They only approximate continuous functions, whereas RNNs are Turing machines, which means they can approximate any valid computer program. If a robotic control problem, like bipedal locomotion, lends itself better to being solved by a computer program than a continuous function, maybe using an RNN would have some benefit. I should probably note that practically speaking, it is difficult to get RNNs to actually approximate any computer program. For instance, sorting algorithms are known to be difficult for RNNs to learn. So as input, we provide the RNN with desired X and Y velocities so that we can command it to walk forwards, backwards, and sideways. We also provided a clock input, which regulates the walking cycle of the robot and can be used to speed up or slow down the stepping frequency. Finally, we provide the RNN with sensor-based estimates of its orientation, joint positions, and other relevant parts of the state, which come from the state estimator. The RNN outputs motor positions, which are translated by the robot's PD controllers into motor torques. We use a powerful and prevalent type of RNN architecture called a long short-term memory, or LSTM, and train it for 100 million time steps, which is about 34 days of simulation time and takes anywhere from 16 to 24 hours of real time. To do this, we use a state-of-the-art model-free reinforcement learning algorithm called PPO. In simulation, we can quite successfully learn some pretty neat behaviors. We can get an RNN to walk Cassie forward at different stepping frequencies, and we can get it to sidestep. However, running the RNN on hardware is quite a different story. Here, we see that LSTM networks outperform feed-forward networks in simulation by a wide margin, which is encouraging. However, when evaluating both types of network on hardware, we see that LSTMs actually perform slightly worse than feed-forward networks in their ability to remain upright while controlling the physical robot in the real world. So it seems that the computational capacity of the RNNs is actually working against us. It's overfitting to the dynamics of the simulation and learning behaviors that abuse simulation physics to the detriment of real-world performance. The solution to this problem is something called dynamics randomization, which I will explain in more detail shortly. But when we train an LSTM network with dynamics randomization, we're able to see significant improvement on hardware. All of the LSTM policies trained with randomization are able to remain upright and walk forward for at least 40 seconds, and the majority are able to walk indefinitely. So what is dynamics randomization? Essentially, randomizing certain important parameters of the dynamics during training. These parameters include, for instance, ground friction, making the ground more slippery or more sticky, joint mass, making joints like the feet or the knees heavier or lighter than usual, ground slope, making the robot walk up or down hills, or simulation delay, to simulate the computer on Cassie running slower than usual because we don't use a real-time operating system. Here are two side-by-side videos of LSTM networks. On the left, we have 9 unique LSTM networks, each initialized with a different random seed. And on the right, we have 9 LSTM networks initialized with those same seeds, but trained with dynamics randomization. As you can see, the ones not trained with randomization successively fall over in all but 2 cases, whereas the LSTM networks trained with dynamics randomization do not fall, except for one at the end, which steps off the treadmill. Here's a video from an outdoor test we did with a policy trained with dynamics randomization. The policy exhibits a high degree of robustness over both grass and concrete, and it's able to walk forward and sidestep up an incline. It's somewhat difficult to see from the video, but the incline where we filmed this was about 3 or 4 degrees, which is quite a challenging feat considering that the robot is blind to the world. So memory and dynamics randomization work pretty well. What sorts of things is the policy learning to memorize exactly? Since we trained our networks on a wide variety of possible dynamics, we think that the policy might learn to somehow encode information about dynamics parameters into the memory, since this would help it achieve a higher reward. If this is the case, then it should be possible to decode these dynamics parameters from the memory. With that in mind, we can train neural networks which take the memory of the policy as input and try to predict the original dynamics parameter values by decoding that information from the memory states. On the left is a curve of absolute error over a test set as training progresses. As a baseline, we use decoder networks conditioned on memory sampled from LSTMs trained without dynamics randomization, because these networks did not encounter random dynamics parameters and so could not have learned to encode that information. The percent improvement over this baseline of decoder networks conditioned on memory sampled from LSTMs trained with randomization is seen in the table to the right. As you can see, there's a negligible improvement over the baseline in decoding damping, and a significant improvement in decoding mass and slope. This implies that damping is perhaps not a useful parameter to explicitly memorize and account for, and maybe the neural network simply chooses actions which are robust to a wide range of possible damping values. Interestingly, the friction decoder actually did worse than the baseline, which I find counterintuitive. My current hunch is that it is very difficult to sense ground friction without slipping. And so a network trained with varying ground friction will simply choose actions that are robust to slipping, preventing friction from being sensed. The networks not trained with ground friction will slip often, and this will have some effect on the policy's memory, which the decoder networks can sense. Though I'm interested to hear if anybody else has some ideas about why this could be the case. Some key takeaways I hope to leave you with are that RNNs, when trained with dynamics randomization, appear to be very helpful in overcoming the sim-to-real problem. In addition, the memory seems to be doing reasonable things, like memorizing parameters of the environment, which are subject to change. Some things that I'm curious about, and you may be as well, are questions like how analogous this idea of memory for the purpose of walking is to animal locomotion. I'm also curious about what sorts of additional benefits memory provides. LSTM networks outperform feed-forward networks without dynamics randomization when there is no need to infer and memorize specific quantities like dynamics parameters. How does their computation differ, and what is the memory doing in this case? How can we analyze the sorts of computation that an LSTM network does in its memory over time? I would like to acknowledge and thank the fellow members of my lab who supported and guided this research, and thank all of you for listening. If you have questions or would like me to go over anything I mentioned again, I would be happy to talk to you some more about this. That's all I have.
Thank you, Jonah. So again, if you have questions, there's the participant panel where you can raise your hand. Let's see, so I have a question from Andrew.
Yes. Just a little question did you consider getting rid of your state estimator and leaving that to the neural network also and just putting in sensor input? And did you try that? And in principle, you'd think it would work worse, but maybe it works better because it could exploit some defects of some kind or other.
That is an interesting idea. Actually, we've been having some issues which we suspect are the fault of the state estimator. To answer your question, no, we haven't tried that yet. But I think that would be potentially something interesting to try because it might fix some of the issues that we're seeing.
Andy, my guess though is that the state estimator is covering up for some of the gaps between the simulated sensors and the real sensors. And so you'd have to do some real learning on the real system to pull it out.
That is true. Yeah, there could be some issues with simulated noise in simulation versus hardware noise from the actual physical sensors.
Could be the opposite. It could be the opposite of that, which is if you put noise in, it could compensate for, it could be robust against those same issues.
That's true. You would have to be careful about getting the distribution of that noise right, though. that could be a problem.
Okay, so we have another question from Christian Hubicki.
Hi, sorry, figured was the unmute button. I'm sorry. So anyway, first off, lovely talk. I have a soft spot for when people do put machine learning or reinforcement learning methods on a real hardware and really put it to the test and see how it works. And you're asking really big questions about the nature of RNNs versus other NNs in coming up with good control policies, which is a complicated question in its own. And you have a very complicated robot, Cassie. So you're kind of asking some fundamental questions when your hardware platform, if you get it working, it's incredibly impressive, which it is. If you had the opportunity to design a hardware device that would more targeted way answer these questions about NNs and RNNs, could you brainstorm for me what that would be? Something simpler, maybe?
Well, to tell you the truth, my background is in computer science.
Well,
so
it doesn't have to be like, what would the gearbox be? But like, I mean, Cassie has 10 motors with 4 springs and stuff like that. I mean, that's not the only hardware platform that we could ever make. It's what, like, even just number of degrees of freedom. Like, would you want half the degrees of freedom? something that not doesn't even walk, something that sort of stands? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Something I remember our lab was thinking about for a while was a sort of hopper with, I think, 2 degrees of freedom, which would just hop around in a circle. I think as sort of like a bare minimum sort of set of degrees of freedom. That would be an interesting control case for investigating memory and its role in the sim to real kind of transfer. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your answer. I will say we happen at the Florida State University have Jonathan Clark's group has a 2 degree freedom hopper that jumps around in a circle. So love to chat with you later. So
yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. So next, we have a question from Art Quill, who is on mute.
I just want to ask whether there's a reason to use LSTM. And so my naive understanding of LSTMs is that they came from natural language processing, where you would have, complicated sentences where you sometimes need memory quite far back. And that was one specific thing that they helped solve, but also traditional, like simple RNNs, where you just feed the output of the neural network straight back into the input, had a hard time converging. And so did you use LSTMs because you needed long, super long memory, or because it was convenient converging?
So LSTMs they were more or less state of the art for a wide range of natural language processing tasks. And in other sort of reinforcement learning applied to robotics problems where they use recurrent networks, usually they use LSTMs. So I imagine that their sort of convergence properties and their ability to remember things over long timescales probably helped, but we also didn't try just a vanilla recurrent neural network or a different type of recurrent network like a gated recurrent unit. We just went with LSTMs because it seemed like an obvious choice at the time.
Okay, so that's all I have for raised hands. I don't know if anybody on the chat wanted to raise something because there's some comments. Give a second if anybody wants to bring that up. Okay, I guess I'll just ask one short question because we have a little bit of time. I was curious, you had the ones that were trained with dynamic randomization were able to walk, and I was curious if they walked very similarly or not. Was the gait similar, or were they different?
So there was a bit of variance in the gait, which you can kind of see. I think a few of them tended to drift either to the left or to the right. So they weren't exactly uniform. They didn't all learn the same exact gait, but they are more or less similar, I would say. So they definitely do have sort of unique characteristics. They don't all converge to the same kind of local minimum, but they're similar enough.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question from Andy.
Thanks. In the noise that you put in, do you have a sense of like key variables to put in? So there's the Rumsford thing about the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, and so, in some sense, you're trying to cover for the unknown unknowns by some sort of guesses of what the unknown unknowns are, and so it's a kind of question: is what things can you put in that tend to span the unknown unknowns? And so I asked this question, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and Jerry Pratt said he thought time delay was like the best proxy for everything else. But do you have any sense of that?
I definitely concur that time delay is a very big help in covering some of those unknown unknowns. I don't have a good answer as to what the correct set of dynamics parameters to randomize is. That's something that we've been looking at over the last like 4 months or so.
You didn't try to trim your set and see what was like the minimal?
No, there was quite a bit of that actually. So these policies up on the screen right now were trained with pelvis center of mass randomization. So we moved the robot's center of mass forward and backward because we were running into this weird issue where the robot would, when stepping in place, slowly fall over backwards. And so we were thinking that maybe that was because the robot's center of mass was different on hardware. And by randomizing that, we were hoping to cover that case. That ended up not being the problem. So we tried different things. And we're still not really sure what caused that, but we have policies that look better now.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you. So we're going to move on. Thank you, Jonah.
Sure. Thanks, guys.
So our next speaker, Christina, if you could get your slides.
Yes.
Okay. So Christina Rossi, she'll be talking about the effect of somatosensory impairments on the rehabilitation of walking function post-stroke from Johns Hopkins.
Yeah. Can you guys see the slides?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Christina. I'm a PhD student at Hopkins. So as some of you may be familiar, after cortical stroke, people commonly show motor impairments. And specifically, walking function has been found to be the #1 contributor to post-stroke disability, but also the #1 rehabilitation goal reported by stroke patients. And so this is how a typical post-stroke gait looks like. This lady in the video had a stroke to her right cortex, and you can see her left side has hemiparesis. In particular, if you look at her gait, she has some asymmetries, and she's taking longer steps with her right leg compared to her left leg. And so this is a very typical deficit that we see following a stroke. And patients commonly undergo conventional therapy that focuses on movement exercises, such as practicing walking, strength, balance, and stretching exercises. Unfortunately, though, even after prolonged rehabilitation, over 50% of patients exhibit residual gait deficit, with 33% showing step length asymmetry. And so what we wanted to look at is the concept that maybe sensory deficits may also be affecting walking and walking rehabilitation. And why we think so? Over 60% of people who have a stroke exhibit lower limb sensory deficits. And we know that sensation is essential to guide movement. So if we were to have a very exemplified schematic, if we want to move in a certain way, our motor cortex would need to compute a motor command, which would result in a movement, which would have an effect on the environment. And then we would get sensory feedback of our body position and environment back to our cerebral cortex. And our cortex would need to process the sensory feedback in order for us to make adjustment to following motor commands. We think conventional therapy relies on this loop because in conventional therapy, a PT gives feedback to the patient about how to modify movement. And if a patient wants to make use of this feedback in their day-to-day life, they need to first of all be able to sense how they're moving in order to further modify the way they're moving. And so if the sensory cortex is damaged and the person cannot process conscious sensation very well, we may think the sensory feedback and adjustment loop may not work as expected, and perhaps conventional therapy may not work as expected either. And so the goal of this project is to understand what is the effect of sensory deficits on walking rehabilitation following stroke. And the project is twofold. First, we want to characterize walking-specific sensory deficits, and then we want to compare two emerging rehabilitation interventions, which are adaptation and biofeedback. So when we talk about somatosensation, we talk about many different types of sensation like touch, proprioception. But today we're gonna focus on something called kinesthesia, or the sense of limb motion, because we think it's more relevant to a dynamic task like walking. And a piece of background I want to give you is how is kinesthesia measured in the clinic? So in the clinic, we have a PT moving a patient's joint up or down and asking the person whether they're able to detect whether the movement is upward or downward in direction. And as you can imagine, this can result in a few problems, such as human error, or the measurement is ordinary in scale, so it may lack sensitivity. And also we know that sensory function measured passively is different than sensory function measured during active movements. And so it may not be the most relevant to walking. So the first thing we wanted to do is to address these problems by developing a task that measures sensory function during walking, and does so in a computerized manner to avoid human error and improve sensitivity. And so specifically, we developed a task that measures perception of leg speed in walking, and does so using a split belt treadmill. A split belt treadmill is a treadmill that has 2 separate belts, 1 per leg, that can be driven to move at different speed. And I'm gonna show you over here what our task, a trial from our task looks like. X-axis is gonna be stride number, Y-axis is gonna be belt speed, and I'm also gonna show you the visual feedback that we give to the participant. So at the beginning of a trial, the belts are moving at the same speed, and then we warn the participant that the belt speed are going to change, and then we drive one belt to move faster than the other belt, and we prompt the participant to tell us which belt they perceive is faster. And then the belts are back to tied, and we perform this for 308 trials over separate days. And I'm gonna now show you the type of data that we got from this task, and I'm gonna show you this in one example participant with stroke and a healthy control. And so the x-axis is gonna be belt speed difference, and the y-axis for each belt speed difference is gonna be the percentage of trials where the person perceived the right leg was faster. So you can imagine if the right minus left speed is really large, the person is always gonna report that the right feels faster, and vice versa. So there are 2 measures we care about. One is bias. Bias represents the constant error in the perception of leg speed, and is defined as the point at which the person responds right 50% of the time. Why so? Because if you were to perceive your legs to be moving at the same speed, you would just be guessing, and so you will be at 50%. Now, as we can expect, the healthy controls has his 50% point at the almost exactly 0 belt speed difference. But instead, the person with stroke has a 50% point when the right belt is actually moving faster than the left, meaning they consistently perceive the right leg is moving slower than it really is. And this offset is captured by the bias. The second measure that we care about is just noticeable difference that capture how precisely somebody perceives their leg speed, with high just noticeable difference, meaning low precision. Specifically, JND is defined as the minimum belt speed difference at which a person perceives their leg speed correctly at least 75% of the time. And as you can see, as expected, the person with stroke has worse JND than these healthy controls. We're going to need to collect more data. For now, we have 12 participants, 6 with stroke, 6 healthy. So I'm going to show you on the y-axis bias and JND. For healthy control, I'm showing you the mean and standard error. And for stroke, I'm showing you individual data points. I'm going to plot bias and JND against the clinical score of kinesthesia measured with the task I have explained a couple slides ago. And the perfect clinical score is 24. Anything less means impairment. So the first thing to notice from these plots is that for the people plotted in purple, they have no clinically detectable kinesthesia impairments, and yet at least one of them has a clear bias in the perception of leg speed. The second thing to notice is that for the people people plotted in green, they all have the same clinical score of kinesthesia, and yet they show very different deficits in bias and JND. So for this, we can just conclude that our treadmill task may be capturing something different, hopefully something more related to active movement and walking. Yeah, so this is the analysis we're planning to carry out with more patients to characterize walking specific sensory deficits. The second part of the project wants to compare adaptation to biofeedback training. And to start with, what is biofeedback training? So biofeedback training is defined as a type of instructive motor learning where we show participants something about their movement and ask them to modify how they move. To improve step length asymmetry, we are showing the participant the position of their ankles and asking them to hit a target with both legs. And this is how an example participant looks like during this paradigm. X-axis is stride number, Y-axis is step length asymmetry, defined as a normalized difference in step length. Before we do training, we assess the participant's gait over ground. If they were perfectly symmetrically, their asymmetry would be at 0, but as you can see in red, instead they're asymmetric. And then we put them on the treadmill where they do biofeedback training. And as you can see, by the end of training, they do seem a bit better in their asymmetry. And during post-training over ground, they seem to be able to retain their improvement to some extent. Now I'm going to show you adaptive training. The main difference between biofeedback and adaptive training is that in adaptive training, we do not give participant feedback or instruction, and likely the participant is not really using any conscious correction to modify their gait. Instead, what we do during adaptive training is that we drive one of the treadmill belts of the split belt treadmill to move faster than the other belt. And the gait is modified by implicit automatic brain processes. So if I'm gonna show you data from the same participant, sorry, over here, Y-axis is again step length asymmetry. Again, the participant is asymmetric in baseline. As soon as we make one treadmill belt move faster than the other belt, we are actually exacerbating the participant asymmetry. So they're even more asymmetric. But then through automatic processes, this person actually improves their asymmetry and goes back to the original baseline asymmetry. The interesting part happens when we put the participant back over ground again after adaptation. This time the participant is expecting the same environment as the treadmill, and therefore they perform the same upward correction that they have learned on the treadmill, just of a lesser magnitude. And this upward correction that they retain actually is able to shift their step length asymmetry to something closer to 0. And so this adaptive gait pattern seems to improve the patient's step length asymmetry even better than biofeedback did. This was just an example participant who have sensory deficits. Our hypothesis when we collect more participants is that people with sensory deficits may be better at adaptive training versus biofeedback. And we expect that because we said biofeedback training relies on instructive motor learning. So we expect it may rely on the same neural pathway as we discussed before for conventional therapy. But instead, adaptive motor learning bypasses the sensory processing done by the cerebral sensory cortex. Instead, it relies on sensory feedback delivered by the spinocerebellar tract directly to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum may modify movement through connections to the motor cortex or directly through subcortical structures that go through the brainstem. And so even if we were to damage conscious sensation and were to damage the sensory cortex, we would expect adaptive motor learning to remain intact. And so we only have 3 people collected with this paradigm. And on the y-axis over here, I'm showing you a step length asymmetry improvement. That is step length asymmetry during post-training minus baseline. And at least from this very limited data that we have, it looks like the 3 participants improved step length asymmetry more after adaptive training, depicted in blue, versus biofeedback training, depicted in red. And so for now, what we can conclude is that the treadmill task may measure sensory deficits which are more specific to walking, and that it is important for us to test the efficacy of different rehabilitation strategies in patients with sensory deficits. I thank everybody that has helped me. I collected data and my PI, Amy Bastian, and everybody here. It was my first dynamic walking conference and it's been really fun so far. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So now we'll have questions. The first hand I see is Lena Ting. Please go ahead.
Hi, Thanks for that talk. I was wondering about how the sensory impairment was related potentially to the native kind of asymmetry of the gate, since they had a bias. So if you put the speeds at a speed where they're, you know, more symmetric, is that their kind of center point?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And we were expecting that, but at least from the 6 participants that we have, they don't look to be related. Some people perceive the legs that take the shorter step to be slower than a release, and some people perceive the legs that take the longest step to be shorter than a release. So surprisingly, for now, it doesn't look like step length asymmetry is related, but I think we definitely thought there would be some relation between the bias in sensation and movement. So what we're going to do when we have more patients is to try to look at different measures of motor asymmetry. Instead of just step length, maybe some asymmetry in joint kinematic or even the force that they produce on the treadmill. Because I know some other works have correlated asymmetry in the production of force to asymmetry in the perception of force. So there seems to be something. It's just we haven't found it with step length asymmetry.
And how long did the protocol take? It seemed like you need a lot of data because you were not using an adaptive protocol.
So actually we are using, I didn't mention it because of time, but we are using an adaptive protocol where we take into account all of the previous responses of the patients in order to give them speed at the correct positions. But still, even with that, because patients are just so noisy, we split it into 2 days because every day it takes like 2 to 2.5 hours with like marking and everything. It's really long. Pure walking is like maybe 45 minutes, but with breaks and everything.
I'm impressed at how clean your curve looks.
Not everybody do curves like that, I'll be honest.
Thank you, Lena. The next hand we have is James Finley.
Hi, Christina. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, good to see you at Dynamic Walking. Yes, I had a question about perception, sensory transmission, and the control of gait. So this is, I think, something that I sort of not struggle with, but think about quite often. So you are assessing people's conscious perception of speed. Yes. With the implication that this is telling you something about how, like the sensory information they're using to control walking, whereas it could be, and it's maybe likely that that sensory information is used at a subconscious, sorry about that, subconscious level. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how you think about that problem? In other words, how do you think about conscious perception of speed, and then why that should tell you something about how people control their gait?
Yeah, definitely. So when we're talking before that, we're not seeing any correlation between movement and perception. Probably has also something to do with the fact that there's much more sensory feedback that is processed directly in the spinal cord or through subcortical structure, never reaches conscious sensation, but still helps control gait. So that is definitely a thing. And if we were not to find correlation between the motor pattern and the conscious sensation, that would probably be why. But I think the part about gait training, it may still be valid because like if you were to change your gait through instruction, I do believe that you need access to that conscious part of the sensation that reaches your cortex.
Yeah, I think the instruction and biofeedback is interesting because now you have augmented feedback, right? And so you have, I think there are lots of interesting questions about how people might then combine visual information about what they're doing with proprioception, given that one of those is really uncertain. So I think there's a lot of very interesting directions that you could go, and I don't know, maybe are going with this work.
Yeah, and when you mention like, yeah, it's augmented during biofeedback. So actually, I guess during that part, even if they didn't have conscious sensation to their movement, they could still fix it just by looking at the feedback. But then what we want them to do is to be able to use that after the biofeedback is off. So at that stage, maybe if you do need to remember the conscious correction that you have learned, it may still be useful to have intact sensation. And of course, there are a lot of like use-dependent plasticity and other things that may come into play that if you practice a long time with the feedback on, you may still improve your gait after the feedback is off. But I think as a basic principle, it would be easier for you to improve gait if you can sense how you're moving offline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move on. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
So Glenna could share her slides. Let's see where you are.
I'm here. Let's see.
Oh, I see you.
It's going. Okay.
So Glenna Clifton. See, oh, I think we see not your slides yet, but like a screen. Now we see your presenter view, I think.
Oh, okay. Let's see here. My computer is barely handling this. Let me try this again.
No problem. Mine gave me the blue screen of death earlier, so.
Yeah. Is this one now screen on a slide?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great.
Okay. So this is Glenna Clifton. She's going to be talking about strategies for walking in uneven terrain and multi-legged animals, and she's from UC San Diego.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here, albeit virtually, or especially virtually. Today I'm going to be talking about some work that we've been doing in the Robotics Lab at UCSD, though I will also say that come this summer, I'm moving up to Portland to start at University of Portland. So if you happen to be in the area, want to keep chatting, please reach out, and or like if you have suggestions for good rain gear, all that good stuff. So so today I'll be talking a little bit about walking over uneven terrain. And natural terrain is uneven. It's not flat surfaces when you look outside. Now, if you're bipedal or quadrupedal, your top priority is often postural control, since you're not passively stable. When you have more than 4 limbs, you are passively stable, yet you run into different modes of failure when you're walking on uneven ground. So when you run an open loop multi-legged robot over uneven terrain, as you can see in this simulation, oftentimes what causes failure is swing collisions. You can see this both in simulation and also in robotic experiments. These are both done by master students in the lab. And really, the main source of failure here is hitting a collision and getting stuck. Now, one way of improving walking on these uneven terrains is to lift your leg higher. This isn't really an optimal strategy. It's probably energetically more expensive. Another way you could use is to identify every single time you hit a collision. However, with a lot of legs, that's a lot to account for. So we're stuck with this issue where it's hard to walk on uneven terrains with all these collisions with obstacles. What can we do? Well, lucky for us, close to half of all known animal species have more than 4 limbs. So we can take inspiration from nature. See if my computer will handle transition. Great, okay. And when we look at nature, these multi-legged invertebrates walk over uneven terrain exceptionally well. And so this leads us to a few goals. One is, how often do these swing collisions occur in animals walking freely? What are their typical responses to these swing limb collisions? And can these principles be applied to legged robotics to improve their ability to walk over uneven terrain? So to understand how common swing collisions are, we recorded thousands of ants walking on uneven terrain. We had a high throughput recording workflow and used deep learning to track the limbs of the ant as it walked over flat and a few different types of uneven checkerboard terrain. And we use this tracking to look at how speed related to stride frequency. This is a pretty basic principle of legged locomotion. With a constant stride length, there should be a linear relationship between your speed and your stride frequency. And what we saw is that while that is mostly true, as you can see in these different types of uneven terrain on the right-hand side here, there were all these strides that fell off of that predominantly linear relationship. And then when we were statistically analyze these different strides to identify these kind of disrupted strides, as we called them, we found that they make up actually a pretty high proportion of all of the strides that we saw. So the percentage of these disrupted strides depended on the substrate that they were walking on and reached up to almost 15% in some cases. That means that every 1 or 2 strides, there is a disrupted non-normal stride happening for these animals. So I won't show you all the details of this, but then we went and we manually looked at what these disrupted strides look like, and we found that really up to about 30% of them are swing collisions. In addition to slips and drags and all of that, a full 30% of these strides are these swing collisions, meaning that one's happening approximately every 4 strides, there is a collision happening. So how do animals deal with these swing collisions? Well, some beautifully elegant work by Dudek and Foll showed that just the passive properties of limbs themselves can help dampen out some impulses that are applied to the limbs while they're walking. So both in recently deceased cockroaches as well as ones running on a styrofoam ball, they induced impulses to the limbs and saw that this dissipation of that impulse energy happened at a faster time scale than possibly could have been controlled by neural feedback. So we know that in cockroaches, this passive limb compliance is really important for helping recover from these swing collisions. But that comes with a trade-off. Passive compliance in the limbs does allow for resiliency to these collisions, but it also reduces the accuracy that you may be able to trace a preferred trajectory. So we wanted to explore if there's a workaround for this trade-off. And I want to highlight both a master's student and an undergraduate who really spearheaded this work, Henry Chang and Justin Chang, that I'll talk about here. So we looked at this in a 5-link planar direct drive robot that we challenged to walk over step obstacles of different heights and at different places throughout the swing trajectory. And we could control the motors through position control or directly through current control through the torque to control the torque. And we developed a simple compliance controller for the leg using both position feedback and the commanding torque. And so we were able to, in this compliance, both specify compliance in the X direction and the Y direction. And we had 2 different modes of limb compliance. And isotropic compliance, where the spring constant that we were virtually inducing was the same in all directions, and an anisotropic condition where the up vertical condition was way more compliant than all the other directions. And so we measured the rate of success for this robot, and we found that the anisotropic compliance way outperforms both the isotropic and the positional control conditions, meaning that this type of incongruency between the compliances in different directions enables the robot to maintain its positional control in some directions, in the directions that it's moving the foot, but as it hits a collision and it's forced up off of its trajectory, it has the give, it has the compliance to withstand that while still pursuing its trajectory. So we explored this anisotropic compliance in a 2-joint planar limb in a robot, but animal legs are multi-jointed and they move in very complex 3D motions. So the next stage of this project is really trying to explore this concept of anisotropic stiffness in these kind of more real world limbs. And so to see them in these multi-jointed limbs and with kind of 3-dimensional collisions. And so cockroaches are a really good subject for this. Like I mentioned, they were kind of historically used to first discover the concept really of passive limb properties in invertebrates. And so we have, well, with the state of the pandemic, rebuilt the experiment now. If you look closely, this is my bedroom and very fluffy lab assistant. And so we rebuilt this experiment where we are filming cockroaches run in this arena, again, with different kind of uneven checkerboard substrates while filming them at high speed, seeing as they hit obstacle and negotiate it here. It's a little bit difficult to see in the video, but the limb hits the corner and kind of flicks past it as it passes through. And with the help of his wonderful undergraduate, Katie Duffy-Deno, we are going to be tracking the limb motion of these cockroaches as they're colliding with the substrate, both manually and hopefully using deep learning as well, and to understand really the way that their limb is managing this compliance while they're hitting very frequently with the substrate. So just we find that limb collisions happen very frequently. Using ants, we see a huge percentage of them are these swing-based collisions. We find that anisotropic virtual compliance in this direct drive robot improves the obstacle negotiation a lot. And we're also looking at how animals with multi-jointed limbs and complex three-dimensional motions of their limbs manage compliance during these swing limb collisions. And I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question from Hansel.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question whether swing collision is fundamentally different from kill strike or earlier unexpected termination of the step.
Sorry, it bounced out a little bit. So I heard early termination of the step, and what was the other one?
And the swing collision, where the animal
okay.
need to react by maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a spectrum for what defines a swing collision as to within that swing phase. I'd say specifically what we're dealing and what we've observed here is there's kind of two strategies that they deal with when they hit something before their foot reaches the desired location that they're hoping that it reaches. Either we call it the grin and bear it strategy, which effectively means that they have just ended their stance early, versus the reposition. They either hit and they actively move it, or they hit and it passes through and they reposition it. And so I'd say that those are both that the kind of early termination of the swing is within a swing limb collision kind of larger set.
Thank you. Next question from Andy.
Hi. In the pictures you show, you draw the springs as being parallel to the ground and vertical. And I would have thought that the principal directions of the stiffness would be more like 45 degrees, so that a horizontal force would cause a vertical motion. So the way you draw it, there's not really a coupling between the horizontal and vertical. And I would think that the coupling would be what would make it work. Is that just the way you drew it, or did it?
I don't know if you're still able to see my.
We are, yeah.
For this one, okay. For this one, with the robot, with the planar robot.
All the schematic drawings you have the springs are horizontal and vertical.
So that is how we defined those stiffnesses. So that was actually what we were inducing, was not in kind of a coordinate rotation to be relative to the link or relative to the 45-degree normal angle, but we were defining the different components of the stiffness relative to the ground, the world coordinate system.
But so if they're aligned like that, you wouldn't think that a collision with the vertical wall would cause the foot to rise. So it looks like you have the foot trips, and then it goes up as a consequence of that tripping. And if the springs are aligned horizontal and vertical, you wouldn't have that coupling, I wouldn't think. So,
I think, and well, I would like to talk more about your reasoning for that, line, but I think one of the things we're also looking into is, as a feature of the link itself being at an angle, how that might induce and rearrange to enable some of that redirection.
But you made the net stiffness of the structure. Those springs are a net stiffness of the structure, or that's something that's added on to the structure?
I believe it's a net. This was not I did not do the programming of the robot, so I can certainly pass you along to people who have it, but I believe it is the net stiffness.
I think the issue is it takes 3 numbers to specify a stiffness in 2 dimensions, and you're only giving us 2 numbers. So that unless you say that these are the principal directions, in which case the third number is 0, you could have a stiffness or a compliance ellipse that's oriented at 45 degrees, which would help us understand how you can push in one direction, get a response in another direction.
What he said.
Yeah, I don't have a full answer for you on that, but would be happy to chat more about it later.
So we're going to take, try to do 2 more questions. First one is Jonathan Hurst.
So this talk kind of talks about this compliance for swing and thinking about it in terms of swing trajectories and impacts and things like that. And I guess the question is, in animals, certainly a lot of the compliance is passive. In robots, we can make design choices either way. And even if it's all software behavior, we could choose fixed gains, or we can want to vary our gains throughout stride for the control. Do you think that this compliance behavior is designed for the stance phase entirely behavior, and that the interactions during swing phase are just a side effect? Or do you think that some of the compliance behaviors in the legs are intentionally or shaped by their behavior during swing phase?
Well, it's hard for me to talk about anything being designed in nature.
I didn't say design, I said influence, but yes.
But I would say especially for insects, I would say that probably and for multi-legged, so more than 4, that the swing phase is a lot more impactful than stance when it comes to having that compliance. As just completely over actuated and overly strong animals that can induce pretty much any torque that they would want at their joints, there is a real superpower to that in stance, but a huge concern for using that when you're stuck in a swing. So I would say, it's not to say design, but I would say the more important selective fitness factor of that for insects in particular, but small invertebrates, multi-legged animals would be in this one.
But some of these, a stick insect walks slowly like that, but a lot of these highly dynamic insects, they're very dynamic. Their compliance behavior during stance is important.
In terms of dissipating energy quickly when they're running, I'm not sure that is actually as important as being able to withstand dynamic aspects as they're running with moving their limbs, not just when they're in contact.
Okay, I'm curious to learn more, but I'll ask you later.
I make a small observation that maybe resolves Chris's and my comment. In the picture you have up on your slide, if you look at the top left one, it looks like the foreleg is hitting the corner, not the foot.
Yes.
Is that okay? So then you don't need this crooked compliance.
Right, exactly. So that's what I was saying with
you get a crooked force. Yeah.
Right, it hits a link at an angle, and that's one of the things that we're looking into modeling.
Okay,
is how the angle of that front link redirects the force.
Okay, then it's not so important what I was asking.
So we'll have one last question from Johannes.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have another question on this slide on optimal compliance, where you were basically showing that kind of an overshooting behavior, multiple overshoots is optimal. So when I design stuff, I typically design it to not overshoot at all, critically damped. Can you comment on that one?
Multiple overshoots is optimal.
Yeah. I guess there was your slide where you showed this transient behavior. Actually, I didn't. Yeah, this one exactly. Was that a one back, with this? Yeah. This
right. One. So this is work that was performed in the full lab, and basically this is showing. So they did a lot of different experiments with recently deceased cockroaches, and then also some that were running, and induced impulses on the limbs and measured kind of the out trajectory of the limbs to measure at what point it would kind of return to normal and look at the damping and the stiffness of the limb, measuring it that way, and showed that it is best modeled as a hysteretic model of a limb. That passive compliance within the limb will on its own recover the limb trajectory within a shorter time scale, like within 16 milliseconds or something, when neural feedback is, I think, 17 or so. It's longer than that than the passive feedback was happening.
Yeah. Do you think that the speed of recovery is faster that way as compared to critically damped?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is faster, and also very importantly, it is more forgiving too than having a critically damped situation. So it has more ability to be more robust in lots of different situations, not just exactly what it is, as well as for the safety of the limb itself. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So we're going to move on before the cockroaches escape the experiments and going us home. So could Brian, you could queue up your presentation. So this is the last speaker in this session.
Yeah, thanks.
Or of the session.
Yep, thanks. Yeah, awesome talks today. Thanks, Glenna, for keeping everybody interested this late in the day. Let me just get set up here.
So while he's getting set up, I'll just read. So this is Brian Bittner. His talk is on a robot made of tree branches can learn to move in 15 minutes, full title, from University of Michigan.
Great, thanks. So let me slide this around. Okay. Yeah, so last year we demonstrated the ability to optimize a library of maneuvers acting on a Lie group, such as the space of planar motions, SE2. To drive home that this is a data-driven process, we implemented the method on hardware with an unknown plant model. So hopefully this is kind of a fun talk to end the day. The data-driven models that we use involve two key assumptions. The first is that the environment is homogeneous, and the second is that friction eliminates the role of momentum. These two assumptions create a space of reduced models, which allows models to be fit with small amounts of behavioral data. It was thought that this class of assumptions were only relevant to granular slithering and crawling and low Reynolds swimming. We've recently aggregated evidence that these rules apply to multi-legged systems, typically with 6 or more legs. If you're interested into how this data-driven modeling approach kind of works, the source in the bottom left at the publication site has a nice video that kind of walks you through that process. We complement these model fitting tools with the gate library optimization metric that incentivizes the robot to find a short, finite sequence of maneuvers that explore a large volume of SE2. This metric, which we call coverage, allows us to demonstrate the navigational utility of unconventional robots. The left swimmer possesses no gates that translate without rotating. The right swimmer is not bilaterally symmetric. Its trilateral symmetry is kind of unintuitive for us humans. Both are adept navigators, however, as is shown by the 5-step maneuver horizons plotted below. The coverage metric evaluates the navigation potential of composed motions and does not care if these motions are unintuitive to humans. Now, let's test the generality and speed of this method by plugging a robot made of twigs into the framework. These aren't as exciting as the Ents of Tolkien's world, but we'll just have to make do with what we have. First, we took a trip outside on a cold afternoon, foraging for branches. We segmented these into robot appendages and assembled the creepy looking robot in the bottom right. So now bear with me as I change my screen sharing settings to optimize them for transmitting video. Okay, should be set up now. Okay, people can see, I'm assuming. So first we attempted to run the data-driven geometric gate optimizer with a conventional objective function, which was to maximize forward displacement with quadratic penalties on lateral displacement and turning. The policy gradient optimization involved executing 20 cycles in the neighborhood of a behavior to build a data-driven model before suggesting a subsequent behavior. We can see here the 2 joints on the backbone, shown in blue, allow the robot to translate, but with a substantial turning rate. Attempting to rectify the turning rate results in a low performance gate. We reran the optimization with a 3rd joint in the backbone, shown in green. This allowed the robot to achieve higher forward displacement and turn less. However, a turning rate is still present. Rather than force the system to operate under an overconstrained notion of translating forward and possibly rotate, we will give the robot a chance to tell us how it wants to move. Here we simultaneously optimize 3 gates to cover a unit volume in SE2. At first, the robot randomly attempts 12 exploratory gates. The best 3 of these seed the data-driven geometric gate optimizer. Over the course of 5 iterations of 60 cycles, 20 for each gate to system identify the model, the robot exploits the data-driven models to modify its gates to find ones that minimize the average distance of coverage points of the available maneuvers. Before the data-driven geometric gate optimization, the robot is limited in the pose changes it can achieve. But after 10 minutes and 24 seconds of experimental data, the robot was able to learn 3 maneuvers that quickly span a large volume of possible motions. So the green is kind of what it was able to do just after that initial 24-second exploratory phase. And then after 10 minutes of following the data-driven geometric gate optimizer, it's able to find these blue motions, which allow it to move around much more quickly. So moving on to planning, something that tends to happen when you build your robot out of sticks is it might not hold up so well. So we plan to demonstrate the capability to navigate by setting up some motion planning demos. The robot had an unfortunate injury just before the school was closed down for pandemic-related reason. Luckily, the speed and generality of the method should allow us to try again with other creepy robots, maybe in time for a fun Halloween party. So thanks to funding and thanks to you all for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just trying to find my screens. Any questions? Sorry, I keep losing the participant screen. Oh, yes. I have a hand up from Peter Adamczyk.
Did you apply any design constraints to your found sticks?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I think I constrained the motors not to exceed like 110 degrees, so that just to prevent self-intersections.
So next hand from Lena Ting.
I had a similar question about the nature of the sticks. So.
Sure. What about them?
So it, how many times did you do this? I know we can't really collect data anymore, but did you try for maybe a couple different, radically different geometries?
Yeah, so I like those 2 sticks. They just happen to work. What's actually not great about this configuration is you can kind of see on the back sticks in the back left, there's kind of this big hunk of wood, and it kind of tends to make it pivot around there. So I tried to intentionally not make this like a super nice platform. So the maneuvers it ends up picking actually end up basically compensating for the fact that it basically has to pivot around this point when it's moving around. But good question. So something like there's like kind of like obvious choices that wouldn't work. Like if I picked like really long sticks, then they would just kind of like interfere with each other and things like that. So I tried to use some mechanical intuition, but not a lot. Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you. Next, Chris Atkinson.
As a piece of art, this is excellent. But, and I don't want to be a Grinch or anything.
Go for it.
But don't we already know that learning systems can pretty much learn anything if there's an opportunity to do it?
Mm-hmm.
And so what philosophically, and we should all go out for beer right now, is the message of this talk?
Yeah, so I think that the message of this talk is that for a lot of systems, learning the physics with data-driven models, you can actually obtain these models pretty quickly on the hardware. If you're able to use that system identification process really quickly, you can do things like navigation. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily do this when we build our robots. I'm mostly attempting to kind of point our attention towards the utility of kind of building systems in the image of, in this case, we eliminated the role of momentum, which makes the system identification exponentially faster. So that's what enables us to kind of use model predictive methods to quickly find useful gates.
So something that haunts me is that we're all focused on this very low level stuff, yet it is the higher level behavior selection processes that really make the difference in terms of the success of an animal, whether the cheetah catches the antelope or the antelope escapes. And, we're just totally ignoring that. I mean, this is not directed at you, this is directed at all of us.
Sure.
How do we select behaviors, assuming that there are some set of basic behaviors to select from?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's definitely a broad question. As it relates to this talk, I can comment on that is the behavior is kind of being resourceful in the primitives that you use for navigation. So we tried to be as resourceful in using a small collection of gates in our library to be able to functionally navigate an environment. But yeah, I agree more broadly, the behavior selection problem is certainly an interesting one.
Chris, who's we in this sentence? I saw me, you. I saw Ye Zhao. He thought about different behaviors. He had this crazy way of like, oh, I need to go through. I'm going to slide like a video game character. I'm going to jump over the thing. It's not pre-prescribed. That's not a selection of behaviors to you?
That's perfect. Can you write a reference in the chat there so I can get it?
Okay. All right. Sure. I'll write that in the chat. Sorry. I just wanted to jump in. I apologize. I'll shut up.
No, that's perfect.
No, but that was earlier today. That was like the second talk this morning.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. It was second. Yeah. Sorry. I didn't know you weren't there for that. But yeah, that's anyway. I'm done.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean that's definitely a relevant reference. Thanks for pointing that out.
It was exactly the second talk this morning.
So,
that was so early.
Wait, we have one more question. Are you still going?
No.
Okay, we have one more question from Art.
My question is about what information the robot got. And I think I'm under the impression that you knew that you were going to feed it cycles, meaning sinusoids,
Yep.
and then it could experiment with phasing of the sinusoids. And I think that's cool. And just to answer Chris's question, I think one thing that's slightly different from some of the past work like this is that you had to learn basically, the Lie bracket. You had to learn the outcome of these sinusoids. But one thing I was wondering is like, so when babies flail, they are presumably learning their dynamics, and they're not quite feeding in sinusoids. And what I'd be super impressed by is if you could just have this robot not know about sinusoids and it's just flailing, and then you give it the goal. Okay, now that you've experienced this, can you get somewhere? And then it will say, oh, the answer is I have to do these periodic things, but I never was trained on those periodic things to begin with.
Yeah, so that's a super interesting question. I'm going to try to build up there in pieces based off the things that you were kind of alluding to. So you're exactly right with the model building process. It's based on basically modeling animals and robots as noisy oscillators and looking at how the perturbations with respect to the average behavior of the limit cycle change the fundamental behavior or the fundamental outcome in the position space of the animal or the robot. And then the structure that we're using in the navigation problem is exactly what you're talking about with like these kind of like understanding the Lie brackets. By looking at the fourth step, we're looking at commutator motions in terms of like group terminology. So we're kind of using some advanced structure of the Lie group of SE2 or the planar workspace to kind of try to efficiently use a small number of behaviors to move around the room. Now, this is just very much applied towards robots moving in a room, and that's not necessarily how an infant would learn, obviously, like you're suggesting, but I think the concept of flailing as opposed to fine-tuning some type of oscillation in an infant, I think is a really interesting problem. Something that we've talked about in our lab just is seeing, is it possible to even motivate, strongly motivate a hypothesis that your neural system might have some feedback related to corrections to kind of some of these geometric models. My professor has been talking about this for a few months now. So this is kind of active things that we're thinking about. The flailing part I think is interesting, and maybe it gets into an interesting a tie-in between in reinforcement learning. You have your exploration and your exploitation phase. So maybe there's some interesting analogies there as well.
Thank you. So I just want to, I guess everyone, if you could give a virtual round of applause for all the speakers. Yay. Okay, so that closes this session. So Aaron and Michael, if you have anything to say.
Yeah, we'll do a quick closing thought here.
Sorry, I'll stop sharing.
No, I think I stole it from you, right? So yeah, anyway, well, on behalf of Aaron and myself, thank you guys all for putting on a fantastic show today. Just some sort of quick thoughts. We had somewhere between 250 and 500 people continuous throughout the day between Zoom and YouTube. So that's more than we would normally have in person. I think thanks to the ease of joining. Saying something for the remote conference.
Let me add to that. I was trying to keep an eye on it. I saw a peak of just over 530 simultaneous people connected. And the first session has 1,200 views on YouTube. So I think we're sort of expanding our reach with this format.
Yeah, it seemed like good participation. At least every special chat room I went in had at least 20 people, if not more. Good conversation. I think that was one of the real questions, whether we could continue the lively discussion throughout the day, and I think that definitely happened. It was a ton of as you said, the poster sessions kind of got short, a ton of science, right, to cram into one day. So definitely, we're going to leave up the Slack, leave up the website, so continue the discussion of posters and try to get use out of that. I think people have done some really nice work, and they should get a chance to share it here.
Can I ask a question about the posters?
Yeah.
I think many of us, there are a lot of great posters and we only saw a fraction of them. So is there a way that we can look at them for a while and then do some sort of a chat? It doesn't have to be real time. It could be written messages, but some way of getting some more time with them.
Yeah, I think Slack is probably the right way to do that, right? So use Slack to discuss the posters. People have posted, files, but also just they're on the website, post links to your own website, whatever you have to do there. And then if you want that in-person conversation, schedule time to say, jump into a Zoom, Hangouts, spatial chat, whatever you want to discuss in person. I think Slack is sort of one way of organizing the discussion.
Yeah, and I'll add that a lot of the poster files are on the program. If you sent them in time, we added that link. And then people have also been putting links in Slack. So if you're trying to find a poster from the list and you don't see it, check on the Slack channel for that.
All right, and then this was not just, people are thanking Aaron and myself, and we appreciate that, but it's definitely not just us. Monica and James were our program committee members, handling a whole ton of reviews and also just bouncing ideas back off and trying things out. We had some fantastic students for both our labs doing a lot of work, particularly last week, but even going before that, Nidhi as well. And then to our chairs, we pulled the last day. We had a number of sort of sponsors lined up, and I thought, even though we with the exception of NSF, didn't end up taking their money, wanted to thank them anyway. And hopefully we can continue that down the line that, for what it's worth, whoever ends up organizing next year, we do have this NSF award for some travel grants to broaden participation that should continue to get used next year. But thanks for the organizers, the sponsors. And then with that, we have this sort of social hour planned for the rest of the day. Get a drink of choice, whatever it happens to be. Hang out here in Zoom, go on a spatial chat, and we can continue the discussion. That's it.
I want to formally thank the organizers. When handed a real bag of lemons, I think they made very excellent lemonade. And I actually have learned, I think some of these online conference things are actually better than the offline, and then the offline is better at something else. So this is great. Thank you all very much. And there's a lot of happy chats too on the chat thing.
And I think that's an excellent segue. So whether it be lemonade or something stronger, I think this is the transition into the social time. So I